In this course section, we are going to learn how we may build components in React. Well, wait a second. Isn't that something we've learned in depth until now already? Well, we did, but there is an alternative way of building components. Besides building components as functions, which is what we did up to this point, you can also define components with classes. You can build class-based components. But I got one important note right away before you feel overwhelmed. This is 100% optional, and in most modern React projects, you are probably not going to use this approach. You can therefore skip this section, but I want to emphasize that you will see a lot of class-based components out there in the wild, in third-party libraries, or in projects you might be working on, because traditionally, not too long ago, you had to use class-based components in certain cases. This is no longer the case, but I will explain all about that throughout this section. I will explain what exactly class-based components are and why they exist. We will learn how we can build class-based components and how we can work with class-based components. And we're then also going to have a look at error boundaries, and at least this is something you should at least take a mental note to come back to, because error boundaries right now require class-based components to be built. That being said, you will not build a lot of error boundaries. But still, this module holds important information about React's past, about an alternative way of building components, and most importantly, of course, why that way exists and how it works. Now, as I mentioned in the last lecture already, class-based components exist and they are an alternative to functions. Up to this point, when we built components, they looked something like this. Of course, instead of the function keyword, we might have used const and stored an arrow function in there, but either way, we simply built a function. That is what we did. And we built a function that receives props and then returns the JSX code that should be rendered to the screen. This is what components are in React, and they are simply regular JavaScript functions which return some renderable results, typically JSX. This is what we refer to as functional components, which is a term I also already used a couple of times. Now, this term exists because it's not the only way of building components. If it would be the only way, we could just call it components, right? But we call it functional components because there is an alternative way of defining components, not of using them. You always use them as custom HTML elements in your JSX code, but for defining them, there is this alternative. You can define a component by creating a class, which is a default JavaScript feature. Classes are not a React feature. Classes exist in modern JavaScript. And you can define a class with a render method, and that is a reserved name, render, it has to be named like this. And then React will call that render method to evaluate what should be rendered to the screen. So this is an alternative way of defining components, and that is what is referred to as class components or class-based components. Now, I will emphasize the left approach using functional components is the default and most modern approach of building components these days. And in most modern React projects, you will therefore pretty much work with functional components only. You might never build a single class-based component there because nowadays, with the exception of error boundaries, which we'll have a look at later, there is no reason to go for class-based components. Except for personal preferences, of course. You can simply prefer class-based components, and that would be absolutely fine. You can build anything, you can build with functional components, with class-based components as well. It just requires a different mental model in some regards and some aspects. Now, the class-based components exist because they were required in the past. In the past, which means prior to React 16.8, there were scenarios and use cases where you needed class-based components. Specifically, when dealing with state and with side effects, you had to use class-based components. Traditionally, prior to React 16.8, you could not change state in functional components, and you couldn't really handle side effects there either. That changed with React 16.8 because that React version introduced a concept called React hooks, which are all these hooks, these functions starting with use state and use effect, and so on. These are functions for functional components which bring features to functional components which previously were reserved for class-based components. And indeed, class-based components can't use React hooks. That's also important. That's really important. What you learned about React hooks up to this point, it does not matter at all when working with class-based components. But now in the next lectures, I'll show you how you can convert functional components to class-based components, how you can manage state there, and also how you translate use effect and use context and use reducer to the class-based component world. Now, to dive into class-based components, I got another starting project for you. And you'll find it attached to this lecture, of course. Simply download it, extract it, run npm install and then npm start, and you will see this simple demo app here. Here we got a button where we can toggle this list of users. Now, that's all not too fancy, and it's simply built by, in the end, using two components and the app component. We got the users component with some dummy users, and there we got the toggle user handler function. And then in the end here, we simply create our list of users by replicating the user component. And we got a button which triggers that function, which changes the state with use state, which controls whether that user's list is visible or not. And inside the user component, I simply render a list item with some styling, and I'm using props. So that's all not too fancy, and that's of course all something you learn about throughout this course. Now let's learn how we could write this user component as a class-based component. So how we can transform this to a class-based component. And for this, we start with the class keyword, which again, just to make this really clear, is built into JavaScript. It's not a React concept. Modern JavaScript supports classes. Now here we would define a class named user, and when we define a class in JavaScript, it looks like this. Class, then the name of the class, and then curly braces in which we define the class now. And inside of these curly braces, we can now start adding methods to this class. For example, we can add a constructor method. Here we could do some initialization work, and I'll come back to this in a second, but actually I got no initialization work in this component, so I will just remove the constructor. Instead, we should add a render method. Now, theoretically, we can add as many methods as we want to a class, and we can name them however we want. Render just is a specific method expected by React, which React will call when it finds a component being used in JSX code, like we're doing it here. And then React will call the render method to find out what should be rendered to the screen. So the render method in a class, in the end, is your equivalent to your return statement in a functional component, you could say. And in the render method, you then also need to return the result that should be rendered. So that's now how we can rebuild this. Though one important thing is missing here, and that would be the props. In the function component, we receive props as a parameter, automatically passed in by React. In the class-based component, that's not the case. Here, the render method does not receive props. Instead, though, we need to do something else, not just for props, but to make the class-based component work in general. We need to import component from React. And then we need to extend component here, which is also a built-in concept in modern JavaScript. You can build classes which extend other classes, so which inherit from other classes. And now our custom user class inherits from the component class, which is defined by React. Now, this component class adds important functionality to make your class work as a component, and that's the important part for us now. It also adds a couple of important properties. For example, the props property, which we can now access with this props. This is only possible because we extend component. Because of that, there will be a props property in our class, which we can access through the this keyword. And that contains all the props data we received for our component. And now we got the class-based equivalent to our functional component, which we can now remove or comment out. And I'll do the latter so that we still see both in side-by-side comparison. As you can tell, the functional component is a bit leaner, which is one of the main reasons why they are more popular. But other than that, it is the same now. We also still export user, and now we can save this, and if I reload, we get the same app as before, and it works and looks like before. And that is also a very important takeaway here. Class-based components can work together with functional components. Users is a functional component, but it renders user, which is a class-based component. And that is absolutely no problem. A class-based component could also render a functional component. That would also work. In the end, these are just components, and you can mix and match them as you want. In reality, you will most likely build a project by either sticking to just functional or to just class-based components though. You can mix and match, but that will mostly matter if you are working on an existing application and you're adding new features, and you maybe also step-by-step migrate from class-based to functional. If you're starting a brand new project, you will probably go with your favorite approach, whatever that is, and then stick to it. But you can mix and match it. And that is how you build class-based components. Now, however, I did mention that we had to use them in the past when it came to managing state, like we're doing it here in the users.js file. Therefore, let's find out how that works with class-based components now.